Thompson Show.
It's really an honor to have this guy visit us, in the shadow of the passing of David Crosby, a guy who knew Crosby very well, a biographer, and he wrote with him, sat with him, and I'm really anxious to know many of the details that I suspect were left out of many obits. And in our time together, we hope to cover a lot of territory over this guy's life, who was clearly a troubled figure, but also so creative and magical in his creativity. This guy, you know, he's a friend of the show. He's the writer of Jaws, the movie Jaws, and the movie The Jerk. He co-wrote with Steve Martin. And as I say, he wrote with David Crosby the biography. So without any further delay, a Mark Thompson Show welcome, please, for Carl Gottlieb. And Carl, welcome, sir. Yeah.
Oh, happy to be welcomed by the mythical applause.
The guy had this amazing life. As you look at, you know, the airliner view of this guy's life, how would you describe it?
Extraordinary. I mean, he was on the cutting edge of American pop music for 50 years. I mean, he's the only guy, or one of the very few guys, to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice with two different bands, both the Byrds, his original band, and then later on Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And, you know, he earned that place every time.
Did he was clearly this great harmonizer and great creative force from the standpoint of writing music. His collaborations began in that Laurel Canyon incubator that we've heard so much about. There was even a documentary about that. You were part of that scene too, the Laurel Canyon scene.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. The house that I lived in at the time was like exactly halfway between Laurel Canyon and all the musician hangouts of consequence in Hollywood, the Wally Heider Studio, the Greek Theater, the Hollywood Bowl, Sunset Sound, Western Recording. So people going to or coming from work, you know, the studios, would stop at the house to have a joint, and, you know, lie back and, you know, kick back and talk about what they just saw. I remember more than once, Crosby would appear with someone in tow and say, you got to hear this person. And one time it was Joni Mitchell, and another time it was Jackson Browne. And it was their first public, they had never performed in public before. Crosby was producing their first albums.
So that's insane. So this guy, in addition to writing his own stuff, he had an eye for other talent, apparently.
An eye and an ear. Yeah.
So Crosby was, then take us through the early part of his first ascent. Then you go ahead. Because after I tell you to go ahead, let me interrupt you. He was the son of a show business guy. Wasn't his dad an award-winning cinematographer?
Yeah, his dad won one of the first Academy Awards for cinematography for a movie called Taboo. It was shot on location in Tahiti. And Floyd Crosby was essentially, you know, American nobility. You know, Crosby has, like, on both sides of his family, there are signers of the Declaration of Independence. And there's a Crosby Street in downtown Manhattan. There's a Van Cortlandt Park. Crosby was a Van Cortlandt. His middle name is Van Cortlandt, like Van Cortlandt Park. And because he's from the New York Van Cortlandts, and also the New York Rensselaer, that's another big name in New York history and politics. So he was from these old families. And his father was already a cinematographer who had won awards and done aerial photography during World War II. His father was quite the guy, left a wonderful oral history of what it was like to live by a camera starting in the 30s, which is what he did.
Did Crosby get along with his dad?
Later on, at first he was kind of ashamed of his dad, and his dad was ashamed of him because he was a rock and roller, and his dad wanted him to be, you know, a classical or a folk, you know, pure folky. But later on, after David's success, his father started saying, "That's my son, that's my boy," But it took a while.
And so he ascends into this world of rock and roll. It's funny that you note all of this history with him, because he became sort of part of the counterculture, right? The hippie generation.
Oh yeah,
the rebellion.
When I met him, the Byrds were the house band at a San Francisco go-go bar called the Peppermint Tree on Broadway in North Beach. And I was in the committee, which was playing down the street. I was a stage manager. And when I'd had time off, I'd go to watch the Topless Dancers and listen to the band. And there were the Byrds playing for, go-go dancers, girls twisting in cages. And they had made their first record, but it hadn't been released yet. So we were just hanging out. I was hanging out with David in San Francisco. And then they finished the gig and they left San Francisco and they drove down to LA. They bought Odetta, remember her, folk singer?
Sure.
Odetta just a tour in San Francisco and was selling her tour station wagon. So the boys bought it and loaded their equipment in it in San Francisco and drove it to LA. And when they got to LA, they're driving up the Sunset Strip, playing the car radio, and they hear Mr. Tambourine Man, which they had recorded about 6 months earlier. But it's playing on AM Top 40 rocker, KRLA. And they stop, they pull over to the side and say, "Holy shit, that's us." And now they're listening to the record, and the record ends, and the DJ comes on and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, this never happens, but the switchboard has lit up. Your reaction to this was so powerful. We're going to play it again." And they never played 2 songs back to back and violated the playlist like that. But they did. They played it again, and the boys looked at each other and said, "Okay, we can start spending money now. We are stars." And they never looked back.
And what happened to the Byrds?
Well, David was always a prickly and difficult person, and they did not like his music. They didn't like what he wrote. So compared to the others, he had very few songs on Byrds albums. A couple, but not many, and not enough to compete with royalties with the other guys. And that kind of rankled. And then and he was difficult and outspoken. And when they played Monterey Pop, he was talking about the assassination and was politically outspoken. And they just thought he was more trouble than he was worth. So they fired him. They drove up to his house, McGuinn and McGuire, and said, "Well, you're done." And he said, "Okay." And then 6 months later, it started Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And he had the last laugh when they had their first album went, platinum in a matter of weeks.
Where did he meet Stills and Nash?
Up at Cass's house. Mama Cass was the matchmaker. Cass had a kind of a salon going. She had a house up in Laurel Canyon, and there was always people hanging out there. And she said, Nash was fresh from the Hollies, and he was new in town. And Crosby was producing Joni Mitchell's first album at that time. And it just seemed natural that they all get together. And nobody remembers exactly where they hit upon collaborating, but it was either in Cass's swimming pool or at Cass's house, where the three of them sang together just for a lark, and then looked at each other and they heard that sound and they said, "We got something." And Ahmet Ertegun, who ran Atlantic Records, agreed with them and said, let's do a record. And they had a manager named Jim Dixon who had already recorded 2 or 3 cuts,
Long Time Gone, or was it?
Yeah. So they had recorded a few things. So they put them out, and the rest was history.
And that's extraordinary. I mean, you talk about lightning striking. You just have to be there. And so I understand that Crosby was difficult, and it's been well reported that he was difficult, and you've just even referenced it with the Byrds and all this sort of thing. And it's talked about really in all of his breakups along the way. And we'll get maybe more into that and further. But I guess what I'm getting at in the question is, clearly he was getting along though with Nash and Stills. They were working quite well together as those albums exploded in popularity.
Yeah, they did. The breakup, their breakup didn't happen until much later, and you can blame drugs for that.
Crosby himself, I think you write about this. He blames himself for that. He says, "Wow, I would have gotten rid of me also," type thing.
Yeah. He was insufferable and high all the time, and they just said, we don't need you in the band. And then they cut him loose, and within months he had hooked up with Nash and Stills at Cass's house. Cass was like the marriage broker who brought them all together.
But what happened to that band? I mean, the Stills and Nash, because they were jamming for a while, as you say, they exploded in popularity that well exceeded that of the Byrds.
Yeah, they did, but once again, Crosby was difficult, and he was lapsing deeper and deeper into addiction. He was truly addicted, and it was so bad he could barely walk and talk.
Did you know him through this entire period, Carl, or were you in and out of his life?
No, I knew him the whole time. When he was in jail, I went to visit him down in Huntsville Prison in Texas, and also in the Dallas County Jail, where he was in administrative segregation. And he just begged them to put him in general population, because for his own welfare, and because the keeper of the Dallas County Jail didn't want any incidents, they just put him in isolation. So he was 23 hours a day in solitary, and you get out for 1 hour a day. You get out to walk around in a yard with no other people. And he said, "Get me out of here. Send me to Huntsville, Texas. Send me to the state penitentiary. I'll do better there." And he did. When he went to Huntsville, he played in the prison band. He had a guitar. He was able to correspond, and he sobered. He got sober. Went to jail. He was sober.
So then, what happens to him? This is sort of. Yeah, go ahead.
He gets out of jail. I think Nash goes down to meet him, and they take him out for a steak dinner, and they go back to L.A. And pretty soon he goes back to his old ways, and is getting so high he's having trouble recording. And there's a Universal Amphitheater concert where the three of them are playing, or four of them, and there are close-ups of Crosby, heavy set, sweating, his eyes glazed. His voice is still perfect. That was the amazing thing. No matter what happened to him, you could just wake him up in the middle of the night, and he was singing this clear bell-like tenor. It was like a miracle voice. No matter what happened to him, the voice never changed. It was always there. I used to call him Luciano Pavarotti of rock. He'd be this was the last one standing.
And his constitution physically was pretty amazing, because I think he probably did enough drugs to kill a lot of people.
Oh, and today
he survived it all.
There's a front page obituary in today's New York Times, which I commend to your readers. It's a very thorough obituary, and it talks about how screwed up he was, and how difficult he made life for everyone else around him, until they, like the Byrds before him, they had enough too. And he'd insulted Daryl Hannah, who was Neil Young's girlfriend at the time. He was prickly, no doubt about it.
Yeah. So when does he get the whole coming out of the drugs? At what point does he get into the daylight, and sort of, what would you say is like the part of his life, might be the best way to put it?
Well, the moment clarity. that he had. He had he had gotten out of jail. I mean, no, he had not gone to jail yet. He was still playing music, and he was still scrounging for drugs. He was playing what I used to call 1 ounce jobs. He would play anywhere that they gave him enough money to buy an ounce of cocaine, and enabled him to hire a pickup band of 4 or 5 players to travel around. And he was playing with a pickup band in Dallas, Texas. And he had his drugs in his dressing room and a gun. He always traveled with a gun. And the cops made an unannounced alcohol beverage control ABC check and discovered the guns and the red drug residue in his dressing room and arrested him. And he eventually went to jail in Texas. He had a DA in Dallas who would not let go. And every time he was out on bail, he'd get high and fuck up. He'd wreck a car, or get arrested or something, and violate his parole. So the DA issued a subpoena for him to show up in Dallas. And he knew if he walked in that courtroom, he was not going to walk out. They were going to remand him to custody. So he took off. He just fled and sold a bunch of stuff that he had just to get enough money, paid the Hells Angels to escort him from California to Florida, where he had a boat. He owned a schooner called the Mayan, which is a beautiful boat, which was docked in Coconut Grove, Florida. So he went down, and his fantasy was he was going to get on his boat with Jan, and they would sail away to some South American country that had no extradition with the U.S. Well, when they got to Florida, he had not paid the crew. He had not paid for the boat's docking because he was high and had no money. So they had started selling pieces of the boat. They had sold the compass. They sold whatever it could be, sails. So the boat was unsaleable. They couldn't take and they ran. As soon as Crosby showed up, the crew skedaddled. They said nobody wanted to be arrested when he was there because they knew he was bringing a lot of heat. He was a few days away from having his picture in the post office as fugitive to interstate flight to avoid prosecution, with pictures and everything. And cooler heads prevailed and said, look, you got to turn yourself in. So he was suffering withdrawal and going through the tortures of the damned. So he turned himself in to the FBI, and they extradited him from Florida to Texas to do his time, where he did a year, almost a year, did 3 or 4 or 5 months in Dallas County, and then they transferred him to Huntsville Prison in Huntsville, Texas, and he finished out his time there. But he was sober when he got out. And that was the difference for the first time.
And that sobriety was able to remain in place, you're saying, for a time?
Yeah, that time it took. And when we wrote the book, it was 1988, and he got out of jail in 86 or 87, but he didn't want to write the book right away. He said, let me see if I can stay sober, because I'm sober now, but who knows? But when he had been sober for 1.5 years or 2 years and realized he could do it, he said, okay, I'm ready to write the book now. So we did. And that's how A Long Time Gone came to be written. And we got a huge advance, and there was a Writers Guild strike, so I couldn't write for television or the movies anymore. So while we were waiting for the strike to be over, Crosby and I went off and started writing the book, which we successfully did during that period.
As a practical matter, what do? You sit with Crosby day after day, and you how many hours a day do you set aside? Do you set hours aside? Or how
We work as long as you can. But what we had a way of working. I would interview David, and it's interesting. The book, I can't show it to you, but the book has 3 different type styles reflecting three different voices. Crosby, first person narrative. I was born, I went to school, I did this, I did that. Then there's the people he interviewed, and I print long excerpts from their interviews verbatim, where they talk about Crosby. And then there's another typeface for me in which I set the stage and introduce the people who are going to be speaking and locate where David was in time during this interview. So there's three voices in the book, and it was a very effective way to tell the story, which we did.
And I mean, and then of course you're charged with updating the story, which we'll get to in a moment, because as you say, his life, it's rich with all of these events, had to be updated in effect with the transplant and all of that kind of thing. But before I get to that, I just want to quickly understand, he had kids, right?
Oh yeah. There was.
That's quite a story in itself, isn't it?
Well, while he was, when he had his liver transplant, which was in the 80s sometime, he got a letter kind of mixed in with all the fan mail from a couple who said, our son is adopted, and he has gone through the trouble of searching out his birth father, and it's you, David. You may not remember his mother because you gave up the kid for adoption and went on the road. I mean, she said, I'm pregnant, and Crosby said, I'm going for cigarettes, and left the house and didn't come back for a year. He took his guitar and hit the road, had no part of it. So she had the baby by herself, gave it up for adoption, and the kid was raised by a nice couple in Pasadena. And as it turns out, the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree. The kid was a musician and a composer and a gifted singer, and he was already like a backup piano player for the Spice Girls for their American tour. So Crosby picked up a son who was like him, a musician, composer. And when they met, Crosby was just recovering from his transplant, and he met this guy, and who said, "Yeah, I'm your son. I was adopted. I have nothing against my parents. I love them. They raised me well. But I play music, and I wanted to meet my father, and that's you. And by the way, we have to cut this interview short because my wife is giving birth to a daughter, so you're going to be a grandfather any minute now." Then he went off to Cedars, where his wife delivered baby Django.
Wow, what a story.
Yeah,
Carl, stay right where you are. I want to take a quick break, and then when we come back, I want to touch on all the rest of his life, as best we can in a short time, and that includes the transplant and includes a surrogate child. There's so much, that just was so much rich detail to this guy's life. So Carl Gottlieb, the author of Long Time Gone, the David Crosby biography. So cool to spend some time with us. Back with Carl in a moment.
The Mark Thompson Show. The Mark Thompson Show.
Back with Carl Gottlieb. Yes, and the canned applause that Carl and myself both live for. Carl, so we were just talking about the son who musically gifted as was Crosby. He's reconnected with. He also had a surrogate child.
Yes. Melissa Etheridge, the singer, and her partner, Julie Cypher, were a same-sex couple, and they wanted children. And while they were talking about surrogate parents, somebody said, well, Crosby said, well, what about me? And they said, they said, why not? So he provided a sperm sample, and it was viable, and they had a baby, and then they had another. It worked so well, they had two kids together, and Crosby provided the sperm for both of them, And one of them, the second kid, Crosby was, I think, in the studio, and Julie was at that delicate point in her cycle where she had to be impregnated like that afternoon. So Crosby gave me a sample in a paper bag, which I put in my lap warm. And I drove to where Julie Cypher was, and Melissa, I gave him the paper bag. I said, "Here you go, fresh, right from the source."
You get the assist, is what you're telling us, Carl.
Yes, put me down for the assist. And that took also, they had two lovely kids. And later on, they split up and they had custody issues. And I think one of the kids died tragically in an accident of some sort. But, but in any case, he had those two children. Now, in the meantime, he also fathered another kid with a young lady who was one of an entourage of young ladies back in the 60s and 70s that Crosby maintained. It's interesting. He wrote a song called Triad, which is, at first blush, sounds like a commercial for multiple partner sex. But he has since then said, no, he wrote it as a tribute to his wife, Jan.
Okay, maybe.
And same with a song called Guinevere. A lot of women claim to be Guinevere, but Guinevere was actually a girl that Crosby loved who died tragically in a car crash, and that threw him off the rails back in the 70s.
He didn't tour anymore. He said he wasn't going to tour anymore, I think, and then he did, though, have a career later in life. I want to get to that in a moment, but when did the liver transplant come in? I mean, he was on the brink of death if he didn't get this transplant. Am I wrong?
Yeah, that was 80. Let's see. Let me think for a second.
I mean, it's certainly 20 years ago, right, at least.
Oh, yeah, no, it was 88, 89, 90, somewhere in there. God, I don't remember the chronology exactly. But
more to the point, he was desperate for this liver transplant to continue living. I mean, he was going away.
He was a week or two away from dropping dead from liver failure. But he had a great transplant surgeon at UCLA, a guy named Ron Busatil, who did an effective liver transplant. And while he was recovering from that transplant is when he met his real son, or his another son. So he had Django was the son that he had with his wife, with Jan. Debbie Donovan was the mother of a girl named Donovan Ann Crosby, who was also an offspring. Then there was a girl named Erica, who had, after she was born, moved to Mexico and lost track of her biological father until he turned up. And I don't know, he must have about 6 kids.
Yeah, Debbie Donovan. Was that he had as a child Donovan by another partner? This Debbie Donovan. I'm just looking now because you've got me
Donovan Ann Crosby's stepmother, Donovan Ann Crosby, and her mother, Debbie Donovan was. Debbie Donovan's mother and father were Imogene Coca and an actor named King something or other.
Oh my God, that's great! That's wild. The kind of the strands that go back to show business, huh?
So that was Debbie's ancestry, and so Carl, his rebirth or his continuation with his life, but I'm talking about the rebirth of his career, in effect. I mean, as a recording artist, as a creative force, that did happen in a big way after that liver transplant. And he had a charting record in 2014. I think he had an album that actually charted in a big way. So he was able to reboot, he very very luckily, the band that he formed, and also he started, because he was not cloudy with drugs anymore, he had like a whole second life where he was prolific. He was writing songs every day. He'd wake up in the morning, pick up the guitar and play. He was really rediscovered his music and did like 4 albums with James and his band called CPR, James Raymond, Jeff Pevar, and David Crosby, and a couple others. And they like I said, they made records that sold.
And finally, there was a documentary done about him. I haven't seen this documentary.
A.J. Eaton.
Produced by Cameron Crowe, yeah.
Yeah, A.J. Eaton directed it. It's a good one.
And then this A.J. Eaton directed documentary, as you say, he is pretty frank, apparently, about his life. In other words, his appraisal of things is, it doesn't gloss over what he feels is sort of the uglier parts of his personality or history.
No, he always had a gift for self-deprecation. I mean, he would be the first one to tell you, he was fat and smoked too much, because he knew that. As a matter of fact, this book opens, let's see. That small print says 42-year-old single white male rock musician Crosby. Physical exam reveals a disheveled man who appears his stated age and is slightly obese. Reveals long hair, which is in need of shampooing. Scalp has plaque buildup. External canals and tympanic membranes intact. Nasal septum is perforate with some purulent material dried on either side. Mouth exam reveals 4 teeth which are broken and badly carious. Tongue is normal. Extremities, multiple pigmentation in the lower legs from dependent edema and hemorrhage. Diagnostic impression, chemical dependency, opiate, cocaine, chronic staphylococcus neurodermatitis, perforate nasal septum, history of lower urinary tract obstruction, urinary retention with gross hematuria, secondary to probable renal lithiasis and colic, fixed tissue eruption to tetracycline, hemosiderin straining of both lower extraining. Patient will be treated for chemical dependency, blah, blah, blah. Patient subsequently admitted to Memorial Hospital, Oakland, for additional psychological testing. Gladman is a locked facility.
Wow.
So
they weren't messing around. And he put it out, and he put it in the book.
We decided, we opened the book with it. We said, this is where we're coming from.
I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that in 2014, he released that solo album, his first one in 21 years, Cross. And it debuted in the Billboard Top 40.
Yep. He's always sold records. Well, like I say, today, January 20th, New York Times, he's on the front. He's got the front page obituary in the New York Times today. A very thorough one, by the way. So anybody who's interested in Cross, look up today's New York Times. It's very complete.
You called him Cross?
Yeah.
And when was the last time you spoke with him? Last few months or within the last year?
Oh yeah, I was. This is the part that hurts. I was always planning on driving up to Santa Barbara and spending overnight, which I frequently did. But my health is not perfect, and a drive to Santa Barbara would be tiring for me. So I've been putting it off. But we've been talking, and he would be saying, "When are you going to come up?" And I'd be saying, "Soon." And the motto is never put off till tomorrow. What you should do today. I never did get to see him, and then he died.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm very sorry for the loss of your friend. He was a brilliant creative force, and it's so great that that life was chronicled the way that you did, and then, as I say, the way you updated it to, include this other part of his life that, he remained, as you say and imply, relevant creatively and in the zeitgeist, and all the way to the end. So, Carl, thank you so much, man. I appreciate you very much being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Carl Gottlieb, everyone. Carl, I'm going to, what is that, Carly? What were you going to say?
I could talk about Crosby forever, but I did it in 2 books already, so just buy the books.
Long Time Gone. And then the second iteration, the iteration of Long Time Gone is?
Since then.
Since then. Carl Gottlieb. Thanks, Carl.
Okay.
Right on, my friend.
The Mark Thompson Show.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.